For our listeners, this is a content warning. Throughout this podcast, we touch on subjects related to trauma, misogyny, racism and medical racism, sexual misconduct, residential schools, as well as many aspects of death and dying. Should you need them, there is a list of resources in our show notes. Most importantly, as you listen, take a break when you need to, and please take care of yourselves. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is produced and recorded across the land known as Canada. These traditional and treaty territories are full of rich Indigenous histories, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We embrace the opportunity to share this story in a respectful, inclusive, and culturally appropriate way.
I'm Danielle Wilson-Brown. This podcast is about my mom, Marion Brown. She is a visionary, perpetual student, the biggest nerd, and adventure seeker. She is in a one-life stand with my dad, Fred. She is a mother of 3 and new grandmother of 2 beautiful grandbabies. She is a TV and film producer, former musician, family therapist, governance consultant, and soon-to-be ex-council member of Githatha Nation in BC. Oh, and by the way, she also has pulmonary hypertension. There is no cure, and it will take her life. And so, we're going to share our story and this end-of-life journey with you. I hope you'll join me, Danielle Wilson-Brown, my mom, and some special guests as we begin to discuss death, dying, and above all, living. Welcome to Before I Go. Welcome back to Before I Go. I'm Danielle Wilson-Brown, and I'm here with my co-host and my mom, Marion Brown. And we are so excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. Ingrid. But before we get into our conversation today, I just wanted to do a check-in. How are you doing today, Mom?
The gravity of this podcast is really starting to sink in now that we've got a few episodes under our belt. It is the sacred work that we're doing that's bringing light and giving voice to a lot of things that, a number of people just don't know about. So this started as a podcast around my use of MAID, but it opens up this bigger picture of racism in every aspect of racism and how it exists in society and how do we respond to it. And, that really got me thinking last night. I started reading the book again of There's Something in the Water. I started doing some reading on the Bill C-5 and how all of this sort of always goes back to the same things and how it impacts us. So we're talking about sort of my end-of-life decisions, and yet the big picture. It's encouraged me yet again to take up space. I stopped asking for permission. I'm just taking up the space in my medical appointments, in my job, in everything that I do. And I'm very excited to do this episode. How are you, Danielle?
I am feeling very grateful. I am grateful for the opportunity to be introspective. I'm very grateful for, our entire team, every person who has supported this project. And I don't even like to use that word. It's like you said, this has been a sacred journey. And everybody who has supported us, I can't tell you how grateful I am for your support, guidance, encouragement. And I am so grateful to have this conversation with you, Mom, because I know how precious this is. And I know how daunting this journey has been, being so open, so honest, so authentic with potential strangers. But like you said, this is bigger than us. Our experiences, they're not unique. Other people have been facing these issues. And one of your favorite lessons in life You cannot fix what you don't acknowledge. So let's start acknowledging this. And on this show, we have talked about medical racism. We've talked about the impacts of it. We've talked about the existence of it and the continuance of it. But today, I'm very grateful for our guest, Dr. Ingrid Waldron, and the integration of environmental racism into this conversation, because they are interconnected. I was hoping you can introduce yourself and talk a bit about what you do.
Sure. So I'm Ingrid Waldron, and I am currently a professor in the Global Peace and Social Justice program at McMaster University. I've been at McMaster for 4 years, and before that, I was at Dalhousie University in Halifax, and that's really where I started my research career and my focus on environmental racism and medical racism, and the social and structural determinants of health disparities, looking specifically at marginalized or vulnerable communities in my teaching and some of my research, including Black communities, Indigenous, Mi'kmaq communities, and immigrant and other racialized communities. What's most exciting for me in terms of research is trying to find ways to ensure that my research informs policy. I don't want my research to sit on a shelf. Connecting with policymakers or government has been central in what I do, what I've done in the past, and what I continue to do.
For people who don't understand what the term environmental racism is, can you explain that?
Sure. It was a term that was coined by Reverend Benjamin Chavez in the early 1980s to refer to the disproportionate siting or placement of environmentally hazardous projects and industries in Indigenous communities and communities of color. In the United States, what that looks like is the fact that Indigenous communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities are typically more likely to be near to hazardous industries. But in Canada, that would be primarily Indigenous communities across Canada. And I would say in Nova Scotia, in addition to Mi'kmaq communities, also African Nova Scotian communities. The Black communities that were most impacted by environmental racism seem to be in Nova Scotia. And I've questioned why, and I think it has a lot to do with the definition of environmental racism and who's impacted. So it's not only the fact that these folks are Indigenous or Black or Hispanic, but it also has a lot to do with where they live, right? If they're living in out of the way areas, then it's much easier to place hazardous industries in those areas, and areas where government and perhaps industry feels that those communities are less likely to fight back, are less likely to have the resources to fight back. And we certainly know that in many ways, rural communities or out of the way communities are less likely to have certain resources that allow them to fight back. So African Nova Scotian communities, what makes them different from other Black communities in Canada is the fact that most of them live in rural or semi-rural areas. This idea of being out of the way, and in many ways ignored by other people, ignored by government. And that contributes in many ways to I hate to say disempowerment. These are communities that are not lacking in power. They're very powerful, but I guess in disempowerment in terms of not being heard by government, not being heard by policymakers, being ignored because of issues of race, because of culture, because of low income, because they live in these isolated, out of the way places. So that's part of the definition of environmental racism, because we know that racism is about power, and why I think these communities specifically are targeted for the placement of these hazardous industries.
And I think when we tie that, very broad term of environmental racism, when we break it down into the day-to-day impacts it has on our communities, on our families, that translates into these contaminants, these toxins. For us on the coast, food is very vital to our cultural identity. That's part of who we are. Harvesting food is a huge part of our lives. But what's the first thing that's impacted by these toxins, by these contaminants, is our food. And so what does that look like? Well, when our food is being poisoned, our rates of cancer, our rates of so-called rare diseases start to skyrocket. And for our communities alone, here on the coast, we see that. We see that every day.
Many people who are in the space of environmental justice or environmental issues, many of them are environmental scientists. I respect them very much. I don't do what they do. But I feel like the issue of health is often omitted from what they do. So as somebody who's kind of interdisciplinary, I'm interested in psychology, I'm interested in mental health, I'm interested in health. I try to make those connections. And food is one way in which people are impacted in terms of their health.
When did you think this became a recognized term and the issue has to be addressed?
I think in the United States, that term has been recognized for a while, environmental racism. In Canada, when I started the work on environmental racism in 2012, I noticed when I was looking at the literature that the term environmental justice was being used more than the term environmental racism. And I thought that was a bit strange because when these Canadian scholars were talking about environmental justice, they were talking about the ills, the bad stuff, the illness of the placement of these industries in these communities, the downsides. And I thought, well, I don't understand how that would be justice, So it felt like they were obscuring the illness. And I think what I explain in my book is that, when you go to the doctor, you want to get a diagnosis before you take the medication. Before you want to hear about the treatment, you need to know what the diagnosis is. You need to know what the illness is. So similarly, when I think of this issue of environmental racism and environmental justice, I don't use the term environmental justice to obscure the underlying reasons why these communities are impacted. Environmental racism is the diagnosis, it's the illness. And then we can figure out the environmental justice piece. We have to figure out then, once we get the diagnosis, that it is indeed environmental racism. Environmental justice to me are the tools that you would use, the resources you would use to address and redress environmental racism. The questions that we need to ask is, why is there a legacy of placing toxic industries primarily in Indigenous communities in Canada? That's the issue you have to unpack, and you have to engage in a fulsome discussion on that before you can start thinking about what are the tools of justice, which is environmental justice. I started, as I said, my work in Nova Scotia, and I would say, there were activists and Indigenous community leaders and Black community leaders doing the activism work before I came along. So I want to give credit to them. So that work had begun long before I arrived in Nova Scotia in 2012. And I met many activists at that time who were doing the work in Indigenous and Black communities. And I believe they were using the term environmental racism. But I think the scholarship in Canada wasn't there. One reason being, as I said, I just think the term environmental justice was being used. And I was committed as a race scholar. I'm a health scholar, but I'm also a race scholar, to making sure that the term environmental racism was recognized. And I can't say that I found many people in Nova Scotia who were scholars who were at the university naming it the way I was naming it. And not that I got backlash, but, because I would say Nova Scotians are very, very polite people. But I did get emails from people saying to me, Dr. Waldron, why are you making this about race? Isn't this about class? And I would say to them, why can't it be about race and class? Because we have that term called intersectionality. And yes, it is about class. It is about people who are lower income, lower on the socioeconomic status. People who are living in isolated, low income neighborhoods that lack many resources. And these folks also happen to be Indigenous and racialized in many ways. So it's an intersecting issue, and you can add gender to that, and many other things. But I saw race as being at the forefront. Reason why? Because if it was only about class, then we would find many white people of lower income, of lower socioeconomic status being impacted by environmental racism. And you just don't find that. Now, in Nova Scotia, I did get to know a woman, white woman from a low income, lower socioeconomic status community called Harrietsfield. And this is a white, rural, low income community that has been dealing with environmental injustice since the 1980s. They have issues of water contamination. But it's rare that you find a lot of white communities being impacted. And that certainly would be an issue of class. But why don't we find more white communities of lower socioeconomic status being impacted? So this is why I see race as salient. There's a recognition now. There will always be people who don't understand the term, but the amount of invitations I get from across the country, it's certainly risen since I started doing this work. And it's certainly risen even more after the documentary, of course, when you have a celebrity associated, with a documentary like mine, like Elliot Page, and you have a book that creates much more awareness. But I get so many invitations now to talk about environmental racism. It's really what people want to hear, but I do work on other things. I do work on dementia and mental illness. But what they want to hear most about is environmental racism. So that recognition has happened. It may seem to some people like it hasn't. Like journalists that I speak to, they would say, it doesn't sound like anybody knows what environmental racism is. And I say to them, well, I don't know, because I get a lot of journalists who want to speak to me. I've done so many interviews over the past several years. I get so many invitations. It feels like people know about this issue. And the fact that it wasn't in the beginning is, to me, in keeping with Canadian ideology, where in Canada we want to undermine the reality of racism. So it wasn't really that surprising to me.
I'm Danielle Wilson Brown, and this is Before I Go, a podcast where my mom, Marion Brown, and I have some of the most profound conversations of our lives about her end-of-life journey.
I like the idea that you feel like people are more aware of it because, we tend to bring up issues of racism in general. And much like your documentary had said, racism embeds itself in all our social structures. Many people think it's something of the past. And they're still saying, why are you still talking about this? And, it's something that we still deal with on a daily basis. We still have people being diagnosed with cancer. We still have all of the issues that come with environmental racism. And, to be honest, I don't necessarily believe in justice because, you have to define for yourself what justice means. What does justice mean? And the whole thing is based on capitalism, right? It's who can get rich from whatever they're extracting, whatever they're processing. Now we look into this new Bill C-5 that's now opening up those floodgates again. It feels like for many different things that we've done, if it comes to racism, it would come to, women's rights, we've taken a huge step backwards. And how do we, it feels like we're fighting those fights again. Because Danielle and I had actually gone to Standing Rock to stand with them as they fought that pipeline that went through anyways. But, they say it's not the pipelines aren't gonna break. They say the environmental impact is gonna be low. And it never is that. It's never as simple as they tell us it's gonna be. And so now, for some reason, I don't know why so many pipelines go through Indigenous communities. It's almost like they go out of their way to go through an Indigenous community. And so racism isn't a thing of the past because, when I think of some of the atrocities that happened, what was it, 1984 in India with the Union Carbide? I remember watching the video of that, watching the news, and thousands of people died. It's something that we have to continue to fight because it's all encompassing. Because once you start living in those environments, your health goes, your ability to support your family goes, your mental health goes. It's all tied in together. And is it a sign of poverty that they had blamed a lot of our health conditions on? You have, type 2 diabetes because you eat badly. Well, how do you afford to get the better food for your family? You're feeling the need, and you're doing it the cheapest way possible.
I always say to my students, particularly, I say the past is the present. If any student ventures into thinking that, well, that was the past, Dr. Waldron, why don't they pull up their bootstraps? That's not happening anymore. I always say to students, the past is the present, So colonialism is a thing of the past and a thing of the present. If not, why do all of those issues that we see in the Truth and Reconciliation report in each of those chapters continue today? Right? So colonialism is what I consider to be a broader structural determinant of health that leads to the other structural determinants of health that we see in Indigenous communities: high rates of suicide, environmental racism, food insecurity, issues around education, unemployment, underemployment. All of these social, political ills continue to happen in Indigenous communities because of the absence of policies, or policies that have not sufficiently been implicated in what government is doing. So they continue. Even though I agree with you that we're moving back in many ways, I still think that policy is the only option that we have to address issues, but also community mobilizing. When I think of environmental racism, I think of one particular community, Sabaganagadi First Nation, where a brine discharge pipeline, the project began in 2014 in Sabaganagadi First Nation. Brine discharge pipeline comes with its dangers. And, I was in Nova Scotia witnessing this Indigenous community in terms of how they fought back. I was very impressed with the way that they use social media, this Indigenous community, and on-site organizing to fight this brine discharge pipeline. And they won in the end. It took them 7 years. The brine discharge pipeline project halted in 2021. It began in 2014. But witnessing, and some of those folks were my friends, so I'm on their Facebook page, I'm seeing what they're doing, and they're educating their allies, the members of the public. In Nova Scotia, we would go up to Indian Brook and they would hold these meetings with lunch, and we would learn about different things that were connected to environmental racism. They used their social media platform well. They had a tree truck house where they kind of staked out. So whenever the police came around to harass them, they were there. They would call out for blankets and nails to build that treaty truck house. And I witnessed that Indigenous community fight back in different ways. And in the end, they actually won, which is, I know, rare. This is often an ongoing fight when you think of Amjinwang First Nation and how long that's been going on. But I think when we have communities that are mobilized, we have community mobilizing like I witnessed with that community, and who are able to get their allies on board. And in Nova Scotia, that was a big issue. When I was there, they got a lot of media attention. They were able to get non-Indigenous allies up to Indian Brook for those events. People were behind them when they did call outs for different things like blankets and nails and whatnot. People were there. They won in the end. So it gave me hope that although we've made so many step backs recently with respect to racism, that if you are fervent and persistent and consistent like that community was in terms of mobilizing, that it's possible to address an issue as difficult as environmental racism.
I think that's amazing too, because it's also, we start taking up space in those arenas, in those political arenas where we have, people of color taking space there now. And, we had that conversation with the previous guest that, Indigenous doctors are part of the Canadian Medical Association board, which is how we ended up with the apology that came to us. So it's being able to educate ourselves to take up those spaces. And I think it's important because you're right. I mean, how do you build that allyship that allows people
Yeah.
to stand with us? Because I have to say that when it comes to standing up for the environment, we're at a critical point. We are it's we're well into the 11th hour because they're expecting the 75% increase in cancer. And now we're looking at climate change. We're looking at how do we respond to these events that we know are going to come, and yet they still come as a surprise every time.
Yes.
And
Yep.
so, I appreciate your work because, like you said, it's like racism is embedded in society. So when somebody ends up with cancer because they've been living beside this effluent pond for generations, you still walk into that hospital and you get treated differently.
Yes.
We've had video of the lady being mocked as she's lays dying in a hospital.
Is that the woman a few years ago
Yeah,
when the nurses were mocking her?
yeah.
Yeah.
But we look at the history of that too. I mean, much of this, and I think that's part of the issue is that when we talk about the past, people think it's in the past. And they don't see that I think the past is the present. Is that what you said? I
Yes.
like that. I like that
Yes.
because, like Danielle said, one of my favorite things is we can't fix what we don't acknowledge. You have to acknowledge that that is an issue. Because, part of what happened with this podcast is I have a condition that's going to take my life. And so I've decided to use MAID at the end because there is no cure for what I have. And we thought we'd open up the conversation around that. Because if you look at even things like MAID, 94% of the people who have used MAID in the last measurement that I can't remember what year, like 2023 or something like that, 94% of them were Caucasian. So what does that mean? Does that mean that they have more control? They feel like they have more control over their lives, or they have more control over their death? And so you have to look at that. And what are the metrics there? How do we measure all of that? How do we measure that our health, our lifespan is shortened? If you're not Caucasian in Canada, how do we tell them that? And without having them blame us for our ill health.
The literature clearly shows that non-white communities, there are health disparities, and non-white communities fare worse in the health area. And Indigenous communities in Canada are at the lowest rung when it comes to health issues in terms of cardiovascular disease, suicide, cancer, injury, reproductive issues, certainly reproductive cancers, respiratory illness. The problem is that our medical schools are still teaching in a very archaic way with a focus on genetics rather than a focus on the structural determinants of health, which is actually a course I teach at McMaster, which says to my students, that more than genetics, it's the external, social, political, and economic factors that lead to ill health. So when we talk about Indigenous communities, the structural determinants are low income, poverty, unemployment, underemployment, racism, environmental exposures, climate change, food insecurity, etc., etc. We need to change the way in which we are teaching, but we are still teaching many people, in particular medical faculties and the health professions, in a way that focuses on genetics. And I'm not saying genetics don't come into play, but we know now, and there was a Health Canada pie chart years ago that showed that genetics is a small piece of the pie. Everything else, like lifestyle factors and the structural determinants of health, is much bigger slice of the pie. So I question why we continue to teach in the way that we do.
Can I ask you a question, Dr. Waldron? How did you get started in this? I mean, there has to be something personal here, right? That gets you, propels you into something like this.
Well, my first interest was mental health. So I did an undergraduate degree at McGill in psychology because when I was a little girl, I guess maybe I would be watching TV and I would see, I didn't understand it because I was very young, but I would see people who looked sad. These might be people who were depressed. But I think maybe I saw documentaries or things on TV that showed people who had mental illness. And some of those people looked sad, and they were probably people with clinical depression. And as a little girl, I thought to myself, I want to help those people who are sad. And so I decided that I would, if when I go to university and when I get older, I'm going to do psychology. So I really wanted to do psychology, and I really wanted to be a psychiatrist or a child psychiatrist or a psychologist. And then I went to McGill to do that, but I don't think I liked the way, I didn't understand it at that time. I didn't like the way psychology was taught at McGill. Now I know that it was missing the cultural piece, but at that time you're learning about Freud and you're learning about the Western approach to psychology, and I don't think it excited me. So I decided that I no longer wanted to be a psychiatrist, but somehow I wanted to bring mental illness into what I do. My PhD, after I did my master's degree in England, my PhD was looking at Black women and mental illness in Toronto. And because I had my own experiences of discrimination, so it really came out of my own experiences of employment discrimination. I was in a particular space, employment space, where I just wasn't getting promoted. I would keep going up for promotions, even though I was the most educated person in that department because I had only an undergraduate degree at that time. I was with people who had, high school degrees, and I kept going up for promotions. And what you do when you are a victim of racism like that, when you don't understand that it's racism, I was blaming myself. Maybe it's because of this. Maybe because I don't have that. Maybe. And at one point, when I didn't get this promotion at that place, I remember going home. I had my suit on and my high heel shoes, and I flung myself onto my bed and I was weeping. And I said to myself, I wonder if anybody feels the way that I do. And I stopped blaming myself. I said, this is racism. I need to stop blaming myself about whether or not I've got this and I don't have that, and blaming myself for not getting this job. And that's when I decided to do my PhD on racism and the impact of racism on mental health. And I started looking to the Canadian literature on this topic. Didn't find anything at that time. This was 1997. And then I looked to the American literature and the British literature, and I found a lot of stuff. And I said, oh, this is a thing. So the way I was feeling so depressed because I couldn't get that job and feeling it was racism, it's a thing. And I spoke to my supervisor. I said, this is what I want to do. I did feel later on that I needed to expand myself beyond just mental illness. I didn't want to put myself in a box. So I thought, let me open myself up to health in general. So that's when I started to do that a little bit later on after my PhD. I wanted to look at health more broadly, but I was really passionate about mental health. So I think it comes from my own experience as a racialized Black woman who blamed myself for things that I didn't get, and then recognizing that, not that I'm not to blame, not that I'm perfect, I have everything, but realizing that instead of blaming myself, I need to look at the systems. I wanted to know whether or not other people were experiencing what I was experiencing and how they felt emotionally about that. And did that lead to, for some people, clinical depression? Thank God it didn't for me, but it led to emotional health issues. So I wanted to connect with people on that level. And I think my research now, with racism being at the forefront, is because I'm a racialized person in Canada who believes racism exists and have experienced it. And I've experienced the emotional and mental health impacts of that.
Can you talk a bit more about your projects that you're doing? We've mentioned your film, we've mentioned your book, but I was just hoping we can expand on some of your work.
Well, as I mentioned, I got into climate change and I had the same hesitance. It's like I don't know anything about climate change. This is the domain of climate scientists. What do I know? But I was asked by the Canadian Climate Institute in 2020 to write a climate justice report. And I was like, I don't know anything about climate change. Why are they asking me to do this? But I thought this would be a good exercise for me to do this. So the report was focused on Indigenous people and climate change and Black people in Canada on climate change. And I found not a lot, I found significant literature, I guess, on Indigenous people. I found nothing on Black Canadians and climate change at that time. And I remember saying to myself, maybe since there's nothing on Black Canadians, maybe I'll do it in the future. But I really wasn't that serious. And I learned about climate change in doing that report. And I said, this operates in the same way as environmental racism. And that made me interested, particularly the climate justice framework. And I said, Indigenous people and Black people are disproportionately impacted by climate change because of the same issues as to why they're impacted by environmental racism: low income, where they live, poverty, lack of access to resources, other structural inequities, the structural determinants of health, and colonialism. I realized it operates in similar ways, and I got it. And I said, I'm not a climate scientist, but I can bring something different to it, because the climate scientists were so focused on greenhouse gas emissions and the science, as they should be. I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm going to take this from the sociological perspective, as I did with environmental racism. So I would say since then, I've been doing a lot of work on climate change in Black communities. I have a big project right now in Nova Scotia. We held workshops in 25 African Nova Scotian communities. We have a final report. We have a policy brief. What we're doing starting early September is online modules, climate change modules for the people who participated in the workshops. They will learn more about climate change, but much more in a practical way. This is all going to be, once again, online. So I'm very excited about that. And then at the end of the module program, I want to develop a climate resilience plan for each of the 25 African Nova Scotian communities, which is very ambitious. People often develop a climate resilience plan. It's just one. But I want to do it for each of the African Nova Scotian communities because they're all different geographically, politically, and socially. So that's my huge project. I'm also doing climate change right now in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So I have a project that I recently completed on climate change preparedness in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, because that's where I live. So once again, bringing my work to policy.
A lot of the discussions that we've had on this podcast, they are incredibly heavy. They're difficult and incredibly important. We need to have these conversations. We need to spark debates. But how do we maintain a sense of sustainability with these conversations? And one of them is how do we maintain hope? How do we maintain that things will get better, things will improve? How do you maintain that for yourself?
Oh, that's such a hard one. I mean, people have asked me, what gives you hope, Ingrid? I always say to them, the young people doing this work give me hope. But of course, sometimes they're hopeless. And they're hopeless. So what gives them hope? Because they give me hope. I'm a cyclical. I always say to people that I've always been a very naive person. I always think that things will be resolved. And I think that's naivety on me. And because I'm naive, it's kind of a good thing in a way where I continue on. I continue marching on because the goodness of people, I think, will result in this issue being resolved. But I have this blind naivety that I need to continue. I need to solve that problem. As I said, it's a puzzle and it must be resolved. There's got to be a piece of that missing puzzle that I have to find. But I also feel naively sometimes this issue will be resolved. So that's what keeps me going. It's not anything in particular. It's the fact that I feel like there's a missing piece of the puzzle. There's an answer and I need to decipher it. And if I keep going and I keep going hard enough, people will come on board.
Before we wrap up this conversation, I just wanted to check in and see how both of you are feeling.
I'm excited. to participate in this, to play my role in it. Because, like I said, the focus of this podcast was around my use of MAID, but I am not my illness. Yes, this condition will take my life. And one of the sayings that we've had, and it came from my mother after we finished writing her whole palliative care plan. She picked up the book and she said, I think I'll write my PhD thesis on Native nations and spirituality. And I said, but you're dying. You're dying. And she said, no, I'm not. Until I take my last breath, I'm living. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm living. And this is going to become one of the issues that I work on. As a policy analyst, yes. As a documentary filmmaker, yes. I'm also a trained family therapist. So I can, I can see how all of this is important, how it's all interconnected. So yeah, we were asking the question, why is 94% of the people who use MAID Caucasian? Because they have more control. They feel like they have more agency over their lives. And then when it comes to these shared experiences of racism in Canada, because I've been told, why do you always bring race into every conversation? And because, I'll go into a small business in Prince Rupert, which is where I'm from, and I will count the Indigenous faces because we make up more than 50% of the population in Prince Rupert. And very seldom are we even in those jobs, the clerks or the bank tellers, or, we're very seldom holding any position. And so, it's nice to hear somebody like you share those same experiences, that I'm not just making it up. I'm just not a pissed off Indigenous woman because, I'm constantly bringing up these issues. And so, yeah, thank you for this conversation.
I so admire you. I admire you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And as we've ended a lot of these episodes, is especially from this conversation, self-care is mandatory. It's not a choice. Through this sense of activism, through this sense of self, through all of these topics, it is incredibly hard to bear. And I admire you carrying this torch, you sparking those activists in all of the communities that you work in. I hold my hands up to you and your strength and the inspiration that you have sparked, even just in this conversation. And I've called a lot of my mom's traits superpowers, and I celebrate your superpowers as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you can come back again.
Yes, what a pleasure it has been. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, and take care of yourselves. Self-care is not a choice. It's mandatory. Figure out how to take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope our conversations provided a unique perspective, opened the door to your own discussions, and offer some comfort. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about anything we've discussed or haven't discussed, let us know in the comments. Until next time, at Liwil Doyexip Noon. Before I go, gratefully acknowledges the financial support of the Indigenous Screen Office.